Richard REINSCH is a fellow at the Liberty Fund and the founding editor of the Library of Law and Liberty. He's the author of Whittaker Chambers, The Spirit of a Counter-Revolutionary, ISI Books 2010. That endears me to him because he received a BS in political science from the University of Tennessee, and then his JD from that little local regional law school, UNC Law School. And he writes frequently for many publications, Society, Modern Age, the University Bookman, Touchstone, National Review Online, City Journal Online, and the Daily Caller. And so we welcome Richard REINSCH.
Well, in keeping with the idea of when did you first encounter Walker Percy, so Percy talks a lot about the leftover self, peculiarly revealed in late modernity maybe. So if you want to experience a truly leftover time of your life, go to law school, and that third year is very much a leftover in so many ways, and you find that what you're really going to have left over is your debt, as I have found out. So, but as you know, third year, so I'm going to class, I'm not reading the material much, but I am reading Walker Percy, and The Last Gentleman, I thought, for reasons you described, particularly the way he describes the South I grew up in, prosperous, and yet maybe only one or two steps ahead of the howl of existentialism that Peter mentioned, and immediately it resonated with me, and so yeah, that year largely, instead of doing my casework reading, I was reading a lot of Walker Percy in addition to other texts. In this talk, I want to show that Walker Percy's treatment of marriage in the two novels, The Second Coming and Love in the Ruins, combines with his thoughts on the philosophical and anthropological pathologies that seem to thrive within late modern society. These maladies, Percy observed, went beyond the conventional list of political, social, and economic inequalities that we hear so much about, and instead consisted in the, quote, weariness, boredom, and cynicism that threatened to rob life of meaning in the late modern era. Bringing these perennial troubles to a sharp point is the tendency of a democratic age to exempt itself from a solid commitment to transcendental meaning and a belief in reason's ability to discern the truths of man's dignity. Percy's novels articulate that within the modern democratic age, man finds himself in the condition of a great freedom, but without corresponding authority and responsibility in the guidance of his choices. Freedom no longer is in dialogue with truth, self-limitation, and authority. Rather, reason demands full emancipation, no longer wondering why the questions that it asks seem only partially answerable by the resources within reason. The empirical foundations and practices of modern science are the only authority commonly recognized, while revelation and the history of a people's interaction with God is marginalized as a significant ordering principle. Thus does man come to deny the givenness of his being, defining it exclusively by will and desire. Produced by these philosophical and anthropological failures, which Percy believed were inherent in Cartesian reductionism and in the wholesale subscriptions to various ideologies, take your pick, are the larger failures in the human relationships of marriage and family. The distinctive capacity of the person to intimately love the other for the other's own good is displaced, if not eliminated, by theorists who narrow man to a this worldly preoccupation while simultaneously denying his unique aspects. One injured element broached by Percy is the shared love of the domestic family, which becomes misconceived and misshaped in an age no longer conversant with the sacramental significance of man. Percy's observations in these novels afford a unique purchase on the institution's diminishment. And the failure of this basic and complex love is one of the most deeply felt consequences achieved by the intrapersonal splits that have resulted from the age of theorist consumerism. I'll develop that more shortly. That's from a great essay Percy wrote called Diagnosing the Age of Modern Malaise, or Diagnosing Modern Malaise. From man's failures to move beyond ideology emerged his inability to even understand love's connection with his existence. Defining reality from the inside out as an attempt to endlessly accommodate the self's projections, the modern individual struggles to make the self-gift of his love to the other. Now, before getting into my analysis of marriage and Love in the Ruins and The Second Coming, maybe I should just briefly introduce the novels and just kind of sketch them out. So, Love in the Ruins, usually described as an apocalyptic tale. That's probably too much. If you think that, you might think 1984, Brave New World. It's not quite that, but what we do have, something of a period piece. The deep hatreds of the 1960s have proliferated and are manifesting themselves in very violent ways across the country. Southern states, without leave from Washington, have decided to establish consular relations with Rhodesia. It's now Zimbabwe, but was held by white Europeans tenaciously for a while. The Catholic Church in America has split into three groups. We have the property rights American Catholic Church that believes in the integrity of neighborhoods. Governor Jimmy Carter would have appreciated that. Their home base is Cicero, Illinois. We have a Dutch Catholic Church which believes in relevance. A lot of us can understand that. And then there's the good old Catholic Church, which is a small remnant church with no place to go. If I remember correctly, they meet in a small building for Mass in the edge of the swamp. Euthanasia, freely practiced on old people. And we also have Bantu guerrillas, who are basically black separatists living in the swamp. And the novel is in Louisiana, in a very well-to-do neighborhood town outside of New Orleans. And the Bantus they live in the swamp. Their ideological cousins, the American hippie, are also in the swamp with them. And they are, significant in the sense of they've largely turned their backs on the progress of science, on the progress of democratic life. They're the sons and daughters of a lot of the wealthy people who live in paradise estates, but yet are pursuing their own life in the swamp. We mentioned, so Moore had three love interests in the novel: Lola, Mora, and Ellen Oglethorpe. Ellen Oglethorpe may be the most interesting, the daughter of Presbyterian missionaries who loves Tom Moore with warm Presbyterian mother smoothings, he says throughout. I love that phrase. Lola is pure sensualism, and Mora is more of, now they're all significantly younger than him, of course. Mora is she's the most childlike. She represents pure possibility, I think. Now, of course, the huge part of the novel is Moore's qualitative, quantitative, ontological lapsometer. And this gets back to the Cartesian split we were talking about in that lapsometer. We keep missing ourselves, and he thinks he can diagnose this with the stethoscope, although he has no cure other than prescribing different sort of tasks to people to actually try and recover yourself. Nothing like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or something like that. So he's going to bridge, quote, the dread chasm between body and mind that has sundered the soul of Western man for 500 years. The Second Coming is really the sequel to The Last Gentleman. Will Barrett in The Last Gentleman, very insecure of himself, not a failure at Princeton, but has left Princeton and is like an HVAC engineer in New York City, lives in the Y, follows a family south, is dreadfully, wants to escape his past and the memories of his past, but he can't. But now, in The Second Coming, he's by any American standards, roaringly successful. He's had a Wall Street law career. He's married extremely well. He's retired early, and now plays golf in a resort community in eastern North Carolina. Who wouldn't be happy? He's not. He's just this side of suicide. In fact, the Luger looks like a promising way to go out for him. So that's by way of introduction to the novels. Let me talk about marriage in the two novels, and also talk about the interpersonal splits and the theorist consumer and how this all kind of holds together. Percy's thoughts on the contorted reality of marriage emerge from the troubled character of Tom Moore in Love in the Ruins. Much is decaying in the grand United States of America. As Tom wonders, quote, "Is it that God has at last removed his blessing from the USA? And what we feel now is just the clink of the old historical machinery, the sudden jerking ahead of the roller coaster cars, as the chain catches hold and carries us back into history with its ordinary catastrophes, carries us out and up toward the brink from the felicitous and privileged siding. That now the blessing or the luck is over, the machinery clanks, the chain catches hold, and the cars jerk forward. Decay," Percy is noting in the novel, "is very much with Tom Moore and the denizens of the fading American age." The failed marriage of Tom Moore to his wife, Doris, in the novel hints at marriage's disillusion at the hands of the theorist consumer complex. Percy's conception of the theorist consumer evokes the fundamental corruptions that have emerged and accumulated from the failures caused by the Continental Enlightenment's projection of geometric certainty in human reasoning. Man has furiously sought to perfect his abode on earth through an imperial reason. The theorist consumer in Percy's designation rebukes a receptive posture towards the world and to the knowledge of his nature, rather than seeing himself engaged in more moderate habits of being, reflection, a qualified reasoning, attempts at virtue, and appeals to divinity arising from anxiety. Man becomes, quote, the giant suck of self. In this posture, man demands transformation, if not completion, by the limitless programs of ideological existence. Reality must be defined by a program that compresses it and abstracts it into a tightly honed package of propositions. The consumptive element is best seen in man's frenetic devouring of ideology. In contorted fashion, these willed propositions feed the undeniable and indefinable spiritual part of man. The marriage's ultimate end is heightened by the illness and death of their daughter, Samantha. Tom Moore, however, intimately understands, in this confessional mode he goes through, that this particular tragedy was not the doom of his marriage. It was in Tom and Doris's refusal to forgive one another and the type of consolation they seek in the aftermath of her death. Doris, Moore informs, sought a Gnostic cure. Quote, books matter. My poor wife, Doris, was ruined by books and a heathen Englishman. Not by dirty books, but by clean books. Not by depraved books, but by spiritual books. My wife, who began life as a cheerful Episcopalian from Virginia, became a priestess of the high places. But books ruined her. Beware of Episcopal women who take up with Ayn Rand and the Buddha and Dr. Rhine, formerly of Duke University. Percy's notion of the theorist consumer is concretely revealed here in Doris's Gnostic pride, salvation through knowledge, yearning for esoteric doctrines. Doris seeks after spiritual theory to end her mounting gloom, rejecting her native Episcopal faith long before her daughter's death. In tragedy, she finds her own liberation in Eastern spirituality that is warmly baked by self-actualization psychology. Doris's Gnostic pride emerges from her acquisition of a peculiar knowledge, not only soothing her anxiety and alienation, most keenly experienced in the wake of her daughter's death, but one that provides a perfectible ideological path to follow. As she tells Tom, quote, I must go somewhere and recover myself to the Lake Isle of Innisfree. The answers for Doris to the realities of man's frailties, revealed by death and the alcoholic and cretinous response of her husband Tom, are found in an excarnated spirituality and an accompanying belief in man's essential goodness. For what Doris truly seeks is to be freed from the failures of man, the soul-body composite, and to seek instead man as the angelic being, succoring on the spiritual hosts provided by the latest Western rotation of Eastern religion. Tom Moore takes the opposite approach. He is in with the dyadic response of creature to stimuli. Moore lucidly observes, quote, what happened was that Samantha died, and I started drinking and stayed drunk for a year, and not even for sorrow's sake. Samantha's death was as good an excuse as any to drink. I could have been just as sorry without drinking. What happened was that Doris and I chose not to forgive each other. It was as casual a decision as my drinking. Moore submerges himself into the meaninglessness of sensual experience and a primitive interacting with his wife. His lower road forgoes the unique givenness of the human person's creative and purposeful interacting with his world. In addition to failing his wife, Moore's dyadic responses obscure and diminish his vast scientific capabilities, which he later recovers in the novel during periods of a middling peace. Inverse to Doris, Tom loses himself in the vitality of fleshly experience as she explains to him, quote, you know the trouble with you, Tom? You don't understand a purely spiritual relationship. True, Tom senses, but as Percy illuminates for us, no one is capable of such an understanding. Now, thinking about the spiritual relationship, Doris leaves Tom for an Englishman Buddhist who's doing some sort of syncretistic thing with Eastern religion, but he's actually a homosexual and is in love with his partner. She's in love with him, and they leave. But this is a purely spiritual relationship. This is how she loves him. There's no torrid love affair. So it's kind of, in a way, it's a weird thing that's going on. That's the Gnostic pride, I guess. Percy's analysis of love in the ruins reveals, I think also, his analysis of marriage and its failure is the effectual truth of the theorist consumer, and that is his profound loss of self-sovereignty, willingly handed over to ideology and that particular ideology's theorists and experts. Man's consciousness of his being as gift and mystery, a sign pointing towards transcendent reality, is radically denied and transformed by this loss. Percy explained the age of theorist consumerism as an outcropping of the scientific worldview applied to phenomenon beyond its competency. So that, basically positivism. Quote, this is Percy. "We miss the point if we say that the Western world and the life of Western man has simply been transformed by scientific technology. This is true enough, but what has also happened is that the consciousness of Western man, the layman in particular, has been transformed by a curious misapprehension of the scientific method. One is tempted to use the term idolatry. This misapprehension, which is not the fault of science, but rather the inevitable consequence of the victory of the scientific worldview, accompanied as it is by all the dazzling credentials of scientific progress. The misapprehension takes the form, I believe, of a radical loss of sovereignty by the layman and an impoverishment of human relations. Paradoxical because it occurs in the very face of his technological mastery of the world and his richness as a consumer of the world's goods." Percy here lays bare a high criticism of scientism and its forgetfulness of the Aristotelian understanding that one cannot expect more from a method of knowledge than it can bear. The hubris described by Percy results from a belief that true knowledge implies empirical certainty in diagnosis and remediation of all the complicating elements of man's experiences. Moreover, the application of physical laws and properties to man's ailments is viewed as the only method for gaining leverage on his peculiar mental disabilities and behavioral propensities. Now, this is interesting. If we think about Love in the Ruins and the Second Coming, psychiatry has a very difficult problem. The actual science being applied to the characters. These are men racked with depression and torment, doubt, morning terrors, petit mal seizures, but they actually can't be treated by the doctors that they're brought in front of. They're too complex, they're too peculiar. And I think Percy is there indicating kind of what Peter was talking about. We are more than we know. We are more than science can tell us who we are. Problems with this methodological imperialism emerge immediately at the level of personal experience, not fueled by theory and ideology, whether it be Karl Marx, Charles Darwin, or any other claimant, is the self, which remains the odd leftover. The leftover self is the sign of ideology's radical insufficiency. Quote, "Darwin, Newton, and Freud were theorists. They pursued truth more or less by theory, from which, however, they themselves were exempt. You will look in vain in Darwin's Origin of the Species for an explanation of Darwin's behavior in writing Origin of the Species." The culmination of Percy's observation on human life surrendered to universal theory was this loss of personal integrity and freedom. What I do suggest, quote, is that a radical loss of sovereignty has occurred when a person comes to believe that his very self is also the appropriate domain of them. That is, the appropriate experts of the self. Man is fully excarnated in Percy's indictment. The ghostly self floats above the body and mind, awaiting its healing or transformation by the expert. Unable to comprehend himself in his entirety, the person is split. The result is a loss of freedom. If the scientific therapeutic approach to being, or for that matter any psychological or political theory, can never encompass the entire self, then Percy states, sadness and distress will accompany the self who adheres to it. The leftover self nags the theoretical self by rubbing it with its implacable eccentricities. Those who have consumed the ideological realm realize their central problem of contemplating and placing the self has not been solved. Messages from the leftover self hint at the paradoxical condition that an age designed by human will to please and comfort the self is in fact the source of the self's most alienating experiences. As Percy noted, the self finds itself ever more conspicuously without a place in the modern world. This is perfectly understood by theorizing. The sadness and anxiety of the theorist consumer is for Percy an important sign of man's unique existence and also his profound wonder. From such sadness, man can regain his desire to inhabit the self and renew his quest for more enduring signs and clues to understand his tragic being and where it belongs. The disorientation of the self that Percy diagnoses in these, quote, dread latter days of the old violent beloved USA and of the Christ-forgetting, Christ-haunted, death-dealing Western world, end quote, portends even more dramatic consequences for marriage. The false surrender of the self results in a radical impoverishment because the gift of the self becomes enfeebled. Paradoxically, the particulars of human experience, marriage, family, work, community, become abstracted features of life. An existence lived without the possibility of freedom, led by higher loves, morphs into a universal, unending, and ultimately defeated quest for temporal meaning. How can one understand a sustaining eros in an age where all experience must translate into the comfort and affirmation of the self? The terrible eruption is that the goods of marriage, prized as love, fidelity, companionship, reproduction, even concupiscence, move beyond the grasp of husband and wife. Though highly prized by everyone, these elements escape man's comprehension if married love becomes increasingly displaced in an age that seems unable to summon the honor, courage, much less love, to achieve the union of the complementary man and woman. Is the age of ideology, and now post-ideology, which is really the endless stream of sensations, better described as boredom, able even to contemplate the sacramental love concealed within this most difficult and most necessary of institutions. Treated by Percy in Love in the Ruins and The Second Coming is a sacramental grounding for marriage, exemplified in the multi-layered communicability of persons. Curiously, Tom senses this directly in his joy that spontaneously erupts from the reception of properly ordered loves. In short, his marriage with Doris once worked because of his transcendent love. A reception of an ultimate love makes possible his particular love for Doris. Tom states, quote, "The best of times were after Mass on summer evenings, when Samantha and I would walk home in the violet dusk, we having received communion, and I rejoicing afterwards, caring not for my fellow Catholics, but only for myself and Samantha and Christ swallowed, remembering what he promised me for eating him, that I would have life in me, and I did, feeling so good that I'd sing and cut the fool all the way home like King David before the ark. Once home, light up the charcoal briquettes out under the TV transmitter, which lofted its red light next to Venus like a ruby and a diamond in the plum velvet sky. Snug down Samantha with the wonderful world of color in the den. Back to the briquettes. Take 4, 5, 6 long pulls from the court of early times. Shout with joy for the beauty of the world. Sing, Holy God, we praise thy name. Conceive a great heart-leaping desire for Doris, whose lip would curl at my proposal, but who was nonetheless willing, who in fact, now that she thought of it, was as lusty as could be. Her old self once again, a lusty Shenandoah Valley girl, apple queen of the Apple Blossom Festival in Winchester. Prominently featured in Tom's observation is the Catholic understanding of the Eucharist and the grace it both signifies and offers to the communicant. The gratuity of the teaching and its practice, which for Tom and Samantha was in a church adjacent to their affluent neighborhood, marked the joy that accompanied it. The delight Tom finds in preparing dinner, singing hymns, drinking bourbon, and reveling in the love of his wife was enabled by this total gift of sacramental religious practice. And recognizing the pure gift of being, and even more, God's rapturous concern with man, Tom is foolish. Tom's delight points toward the reception of his being, of locating it through and under God, and also in Doris's being. Their love peculiarly opened to them, to both of them, from the hybridized transcendence of the Eucharist. The grounding of Tom's being in the reception of the Eucharist returns the discussion to Percy's diagnosis of the self and its interior disloyalty in the theorist consumer age. Tom's joy points directly to a transcendent God intimately acquainted with his personal destiny. Thus, he is liberated from the false transcendence of the scientific approach to being and its unnecessary reduction of the human person to a quantifiable monad, unable to place his loves, anxieties, hatreds, and eternal longings. Tom's fullest appreciation emerges in one of his final recollections of his former marriage. Here, Tom relates a sacramentality of common life, existing paradoxically in the attempts of geographical escape he and Doris periodically attempted. Quote, "Sunday mornings I'd leave her and go to Mass. Now here was the strangest exercise of all. Leaving the coordinate of the motel at the intersection of the interstates, leaving the motel with standard doors and carpets and plumbing, leaving the interstates extending infinitely in all directions, descending through a moonscape countryside to a town where people had been living all these years into some forlorn little Catholic church up a side street just in time for the 10:30 Mass. Stepping up on the porch as if I had been doing it for some 20 years, here comes the stove-up, bemused priest with his cup. "What am I doing out here?" says this dazed expression, "upon whose head hands had been laid, and upon this other head other hands, and so on. For here, off I-51, I touched the thread in the labyrinth." And the priest announced the turkey raffle and Wednesday bingo and preached the gospel and fed me Christ. Back to the motel then. Exhilarated by what? By eating Christ? Or by the secret discovery of the singular thread in this, the unlikeliest of places, the geometry of Holiday Inns and interstates? Back to lie with Doris, all rosy-fleshed and creased of cheek and slack and heavy-limbed with sleep, cracking one eye and opening her arms and smiling. "My God, what is it you do in church?" What she didn't understand, she being spiritual and seeing religion as spirit, was that it took religion to save me from the spirit world, from orbiting the earth like Lucifer and the angels, that it took nothing less than touching the thread off the misty interstates and eating Christ himself to make me mortal man again and let me inhabit my own flesh and love her in the morning. The recovery of his self in Mass makes life possible for Tom in its most fundamental form. Percy's reference to, quote, orbiting the earth like Lucifer and the angels touches upon the split persona inherent in the scientific turn of human understanding, while Tom's reception of the Eucharist and his ensuing joy in the common goods of life transcends scientism's reductionism. These extraordinary and common graces locate the self within time, in a place situated with other selves, who now are comprehensible, even lovable. Thus the sheer commonality and limitations of everyday living stand revealed in their hopeful beauty and truth to the communicant Tom. To believe is to grasp in acute form the full measure of reality and man's place within it. Self-consciousness ceases being an unending burden of anxiety and fear, and instead becomes the medium of delight in the ordinary run of a man's life. In the second coming, Percy provides yet another avenue into the difficulties of married love that arise from existential disorder. Will Barrett, a lonely rich widower, barely this side of suicide, ventures into a cave to pursue his own Pascalian wager, although it's more of a Gnostic, thing that he's doing. He will leave the cave only upon proof of God's existence. Failing this, he will stay in the cave until his death, the waiting eased by sleeping pills. Barrett, of course, is not in search of God so much. Rather, he searches for God in the manner of a doubting Thomas who wants to believe on his own terms, not on the terms of faith, hope, and love. Barrett wants to relieve his torment and the crippling memories of his childhood. Of course, as he says, I remember everything, right? And of course, what does he remember? His father hated life so much, struggled with it so much, that he tried to kill him, and then himself, to save him from the ordeal of a death in life. Barrett's waiting God out ends not from any direct revelation, or lack thereof, but from the onset of an abscessed tooth, which drives him from the cave, vomiting in pain. In the very attempt to move beyond the limitations of his creatureliness, Barrett is incapacitated by his physical weaknesses. The departure from the cave, however, brings Barrett literally falling into the arms of another searcher, Alison Huger, the daughter of his decades-old former love interest, Kitty Vaught. Read The Last Gentleman. Barrett does not ascend from the cave like Dante's pilgrim. Instead, he gets lost and falls into Allie's greenhouse. Allie, of course, is lost herself, an escapee of an asylum. Her primordial aim is to reconnect with reality through language. Her attempts are fitful and incomplete in effectuating this, but from the solitude of her greenhouse, she stumbles upon her own stratagem of being and also finds a sacrament of the ordinary. Here's one of her reflections. All this time she had made a mistake. She had thought, and her mother had expected, that she must do something extraordinary, be somebody extraordinary. whereas the trick lay in leading the most ordinary life imaginable. Get an ordinary job, in itself a joy in its very ordinariness, and then be as extraordinary or ordinary as one pleased. That was the secret. If in Percy's rendering the disease of late modernity is a crushing existential disloyalty, man's refusal to face his immutable nature, then Alley, who has spent years in a mental facility, is the wayfaring pilgrim, desperately seeking an existence where words and lives touch indispensable meaning. After his descent into Alley's cave-side home, Barrett's recovery of his self-understanding and identity proceeds apace. A man unable to endure himself, caught between the abyss of suicide or the sterilized existence of a psychotropic drug regimen, begins his recovery in Alley's care. Both are searchers. Her quest is to grasp reality through language. Barrett desires to cut through his memories, his fugues, fits of falling, petit mal seizures, and thus answer the question of his own being. Strangely, their meeting one another provides the logos of meaning both require. Alley and Barrett have emerged from their own separate platonic caves where therapeutic shadows flicker on the walls, attempting to erase the real pains of personal confusion and depression. They now see themselves clearly. To be self-knowing for the first time in a long time is the authentic liberation. Revealed to Alley is the irreplaceable need for the other. Precisely who this person is or what she was to do for them remained unclear. She catalogs prior romantic relationships, but this leaves her even more remote from this prospect. Love is foreign to her, not just because of meaningless attempts with former men, but owing most prominently to the detraction dealt her by her parents. Alley gathers that her mother, Kitty, had preferred ensconcing her in an asylum rather than personally squaring with her difficulties. The abstracted manner of her mother's care resulted from the daughter's failure to be happy, adjusted, and pleased with self amidst the other selves. This had rendered Alley incomprehensible to her mother. Will Barrett, or the stranger as Alley refers to him initially, has an immense need of her. Her first interaction had been to hoist him from the ground after he tumbles into her home. Beyond immediate care and feeding, Barrett is one who frequently falls in sublime and ridiculous ways. Alley intuits that her contribution to Barrett is the careful and loving hoisting of his person from the earth. In short, she is the Archimedean lift in life that places Barrett above the constant terrors that have enfeebled him. Alley proclaims to a local townsman, quote, "I can do two things, sing and hoist. With block and tackle, differential gears, endless chain gears, double and triple blocks, I can hoist anything if I have a fixed point and time to figure," end quote. If Barrett is drenched in too much reality, then Alley is too far from it. Her insufficient memory are compensated by Barrett's obsessiveness. Thus does their love find its function and its completion in their own natural and passing strange complementarities. Percy's depiction of Barrett and Alley ends with Barrett divesting himself of his deceased wife's fortune, emerging from early retirement and practicing law and intending to raise his children from his marriage to Alley in the community, rather than in his robust mountain estate or in an alienating high-rise condominium in Manhattan where his first daughter was raised, his eldest daughter, his only daughter. The sacrament of the ordinary, of delight in labor, home, and in his wife and children mark a new promise for Barrett at the novel's end. Dispensed from isolation and therapeutic control, Alley also appears committed to a shared life, lived on the renewed terms of a properly ordered and placed self. Percy set a similar theme in the ending to Love in the Ruins with Tom's marriage to Ellen Oglethorpe, his dutiful clinic nurse. Here too we are witness to marriage, the arrival of children, and life lived in more humble and thoughtful circumstances. Both settings witness the return of religious faith, if incompletely to Barrett and Tom. Tom returns to sacramental practice and even takes to public penance at the end of the novel in reparation for former sins, although he doesn't feel sorry for them. The practice having been reintroduced by current Pope John XXIV. Percy hints that the absence of great wealth, mansions, and servants has liberated the characters to an ease with themselves obscured in former times. Tom reflects, quote, "Here's one difference between this age and the last. Now while you work, you also watch and listen and wait. In the last age, we planned projects and cast ahead of ourselves. We set out to reach goals. We listened to the minutes of the previous meeting. between times we took vacations, end quote. To be sure, Percy is not proposing an anti-progress theme. The clarity experienced by More and Barrett does not result solely from material humility. The heights that they reached were possible because of a confrontation both men made with death and God. The searching of More and Barrett has led to depression, drinking, attempted suicides, and an awareness of their death in life. But it has also produced thick answers to the questions of why and how one should live. The leftover self, escaping difficulties with peaceful existence, has been the ultimate sign for each man, pointing to a reality that transcends the human will. The irrepressible fact of eros, present even in the middle age of men who live in profound woe and self-displacement, is another sign of man's incompleteness. Thus does the taking of more humble work, of marrying, of having children, of living in modesty, enjoying early mornings on the bayou, as Tom Moore tells us, reflectively understood through religion, are the mundane and profound clues left the reader from these two novels.